Coming up on Mountain Hermeneutics. Remember we are gonna do Wes Huff? Well, we're gonna do Wes Huff. So my man, just keep it right here. It's Wes Huff. You're listening to Mount Hermeneutics, where three Marines give their perspective on God, faith, and spirituality with a heavy lean on the divine council worldview. This is not your grandma's Sunday school, nor is it always for the Christian faint of heart. Nothing about who we are or what we say make us experts. But you better believe we'll have a take, and perhaps it won't suck.
Well, you and I disagreed with Matt.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Y'all were wrong. It's okay.
No, your mom has pagan origins. Remember, the show is free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube, simply by searching for Mount Hermeneutics. And if this is your first time with us, I am Andre. That's Matt. That's Brian. Fellas, what's happening?
Hey, guys.
Are we really going to do Wes Huff this time?
Let's just do Wes Huff.
What happened last time? How did we get so far off course?
Brian was in a cult.
Oh yeah,
It occurred to me since last time that like this is why I don't usually say much about what I've been up to, because
you're always in a cult.
Well,
we're 75 episodes in. Brian, what have you been up to? Not a lot. Last week he goes, so guys, I almost joined a cult. We were like, what?
Yeah. Well, it's just that my life.
Here it goes.
My life is so interesting and exciting that if I tell people about it, it's just that's going to be the show, and it's going to derail everything.
You're so aware of your ability to take the show over, and you don't want to do that.
That's right. I've been restraining myself.
And so
you're
being selfless and not making it about you.
Yeah, let's go with that.
And for us little guys, I appreciate getting my airtime. Thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
God bless.
I'm
each and every one of
gratitude.
Us.
Yeah.
Thanks for playing along, guys.
So how did this obscure Canadian doctorate student just become like the Christian sphere of the internet? Like
he's the it guy right now, right?
This cat is in my feed, all he did was debate basically a History Channel ancient aliens dude, right? And
yeah, Billy Carson, from what I can tell, he basically just regurgitates Zecharia Sitchin, who came up with all that ancient alien stuff.
Sure.
But yeah, so just to kind of,
I'm a Billy Carson fan, by the way. So just
for any listeners who aren't familiar with this whole timeline here, I've been seeing Wes Huff pop up in my suggested videos. I've seen some of his stuff. I like him. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but I never heard of Billy Carson until I started getting all of these like responses to Wes Huff debates Billy Carson. And then that led to Joe Rogan interviewing Wes Huff. And then that launched this whole like cottage industry of people responding to Wes Huff on Joe Rogan.
Everybody, and from atheists to Christians alike.
Mm-hmm.
So Catholics and Lutherans, like what Wesley Huff said is not what we endorse. And Wes Huff debunked himself. He has a video of him debunking himself from the Joe Rogan episode. So it's interesting that everybody, because of Joe Rogan, we got to come out and give our take, and we'll get clicks because this dude's name is trending, right? So
yeah, the thing is, I was last week when we were going to do this, before I ungraciously derailed it and made it about me. I was going to do it about Alex O'Connor's response to Wes Huff.
Yeah.
And kind of respond to some of the points that Alex O'Connor made, because I thought he made some good points, but there was this one particular topic that he centered on that I think deserves.
Let's go ahead and get into it. I know there's some time has passed, and there's been a lot of react to the videos, but I think we're actually at a perfect place time wise where some of the dust has settled now. and people are not jumping on over the top of each other, right? So there's been a lot of time for thoughts to clear and everybody to take a breath. And like you, Brian, I still think there's some interesting points that Alex specifically brought up that I want to talk about. Just, he said a couple of things that, I've got my couple of notes that I'm like, huh.
Alex O'Connor also made another video talking about where
debunking
he
himself.
debunking himself,
Yeah.
debunking Wes Huff, and
I'm not that caught up yet on.
And a lot of it, centers around Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, that seems to be the core of what everybody is wanting to jump into, the great Isaiah scroll.
Because it was such an audacious claim on
every
Rogan,
single word
for word, and everyone was, oh,
yeah.
Oh.
But that's good because I have a totally different emphasis. I mean, I was going to home in on the 500 witnesses thing.
That was a really cool point. And I also let's go ahead and just tip our hand. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the scripture relying on other scripture. I thought that was a really interesting point that Alex brought up.
Yeah.
So that was the thing that I was like, so anybody else listening that hasn't heard me say this, I'm kind of weird. And when I'm in the gym, I don't listen to music. I don't get pumped or hype. I listen to podcasts. And so I'm like in the gym listening. And I'm like, huh, interesting. And then I do finish my rep or whatever I'm doing. And so I was listening to Alex as I was in the gym, and he threw out some of these things. And I was like, that's interesting.
I almost dropped the dumbbell because I was listening to Crowder. I'm like, okay, I got to turn it off because I'm laughing. Like,
did
stop
Crowder talk about that?
No, but he says other funny shit. So I'm just talking about in the gym listening to podcasts. And
okay.
Sometimes I'll hear something way too funny, and I'm like, what? Okay, I need something to not make me laugh while I'm.
Hey, laughter's good. I like it.
I actually when I work out, I play the early 2000s Ben Affleck Daredevil soundtrack.
That doesn't make you laugh?
No, it pumps me up.
I don't know those songs.
That's how Evanescence was introduced to the world, and all kinds of other. It was in this weird kind of musical place.
Wow.
I'm not ashamed. It's still
wow.
It's a habit I got into 20 years ago when that movie came out, and I'm just now it's like part of my OCD. It's part of the program.
Daredevil the album.
Yeah.
This is a worthwhile derailment, by the way.
Seether, Nickelback, Drowning Pool, Rob Zombie, Fuel, Saliva, Evanescence, Chevelle, Hoobastank. Wow,
that sounds dope as fuck. Like,
right? I mean, Finger 11.
You know what, Ben Affleck? I'm not mad at you anymore.
Wow, I've got to pull this. Brian, this might be the most impressive thing you've brought to my attention.
And we
on this show.
Really?
And we mocked you.
Because that's the point. We were both like, Daredevil.
I mean,
like that movie sucks. Like, why would you?
Yeah, the movie sucks. The soundtrack was awesome.
I mean,
you think the movie sucked?
The movie sucked.
Yes.
I didn't think so.
The director's cut is slightly better, but the movie sucked. It totally sucked. The costume was cool. I liked the costume. Like he looked like Daredevil, except for the dark black hair. But
Daredevil can't have black hair.
Daredevil is a ginger. He's
a ginga.
He's
the Daredevil in the series isn't a ginger.
Well, you have to squint a little bit, and he's a ginger. But he's renowned as the first ginger superhero, and they made him Catholic to offset the not having souls thing.
He's the first one.
The first ginger superhero, that's for sure. Unless you count Jimmy Olsen.
Isn't the Flash one of the Flashes a ginger?
Daredevil was first.
Oh.
The third Flash, Wally West, but he wasn't the Flash until after Crisis on Infinite Earths, when Barry Allen was killed trying to outrun a tachyon. But
yeah, single Brian.
Touche. All right.
All right, let's get into this.
All right.
So Alex O'Connor.
O'Connor.
Yeah, O'Connor. So he went at Wes's Joe Rogan Experience. And like you mentioned, his first thing, the thing that he spent the most time on was really hovering on the claim that Wes Huff made that the so I guess we should back up. So Wes talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we've touched on those here, but we should probably make sure we backed up in case we have new listeners, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls were a massively important find for historians as well as Christians, because it validated and gave insight to a lot of historical research. And Brian, I know you'll keep me honest, but I'm just gonna riff off the cuff here. Up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a lot of the source material that we had for the Bible was limited to this side of BC, and a lot of it was thought to have been much later in creation, writing. Like there was no proof or evidence that some of this stuff existed previously, and then a lot of it also there was confusion or disagreements about some translations from the Masoretic text, which was the original Hebrew that we had brought over into Protestantism or Christianity rather. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls were incredibly old, dating back to a couple thousand years BC. Is that how far back some of that went?
No, I wouldn't go that. I wouldn't go back that far. They were deposited probably in the 1st century, but the texts themselves were like a couple of 100 years old to them.
From when they were deposited. So
right.
So still
like 2 or 3, like probably like 2nd, maybe 3rd century BC.
Okay.
But mostly like 1st century, 2nd century BC stuff. But the real importance, it wasn't that the Bible was, that everything was just up for grabs and that there was a lot of controversy about the reliability of the Old Testament. But we basically had 2 manuscript traditions to choose from: the Masoretic text, which is the standard Jewish text, which is in the quote unquote original Hebrew, except original Hebrew didn't have vowels and punctuation marks. They invented that for the Masoretic text. It's kind of an early medieval text. And then you had the Septuagint, which was the standard Greek translation from that started in the Ptolemaic period in the 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC. Yeah, third or 2nd century. Who doesn't matter. I don't want to revisit all the details this time, but
sure.
It was basically those 2 were the manuscript traditions for
it's
our
Paul's
Old
text.
Testament. Yeah, most of what you've typically, if you find the Old Testament quoted in the New Testament, it's from the Septuagint. There were some discrepancies between them. Well, there are some discrepancies between them. Academics typically defaulted to the Masoretic because it's the supposedly original
more pure,
Hebrew,
pristine. Yeah.
Except the Septuagint is a witness to an older manuscript tradition than the Masoretic text. But anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the real importance is that it provides another manuscript tradition to kind of balance, to kind of fill in the gaps between these 2 and resolve some discrepancies and controversies. And it, as it turns out, it actually, for the most part, not always. I don't want to overstate something and get Alex O'Connor probably won't notice if I overstate something, but just to be careful, most of the time, not all of the time, it favors the Septuagint over the Masoretic. But it has portions of the Book of Enoch, which kind of caused academics to sort of kind of rethink the place of the Book of Enoch in 1st century Judaism. And it wasn't that there was
that's where Ethiopia is like, are we a joke to you? Like
but yeah, a lot of the study of Enoch was kind of sparked by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so, but as Wes Huff discussed, there was an almost complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, which, as he stated, is word for word identical to what had been preserved in the Masoretic and the to the Masoretic, except the
And this
thing
is
that
the point in the Joe Rogan Experience where Joe's like, "Wait, it was the same?" And then Wes really doubled down on that, and Joe's like, "Wow!" And
Yeah.
and he's buying it, and it sounds really cool conversationally, and I think being um, trying to be charitable to Wes. Definitely don't think Wes was intentionally wrong. I don't think he was purposefully
yeah
misspeaking. Right? He was trying to make the point that from a functional point of view, there was essentially nothing that was materially
right.
different that would cause a theological or a historical disconnect between what was
he
found versus what we understood it to be.
he was trying to put it in layperson's
Right.
terms with
He wasn't
and
speaking to a
right
historian or a biblical
it
scholar or an
and if
Alex O'Connor.
yeah and when you and I think Alex well, I don't want to. I think Alex O'Connor was being somewhat uncharitable in his treatment of it. If you adjust for the fact that Wes Huff is speaking to a layperson and didn't want to get into all of the weeds and explain all of the boring details about, word for word identical, what that means to a critical textual scholar, he was right. I mean, it's if you want to home in and get and look at details, sure. There were some, there are places where, like, the Masoretic text, Isaiah is condemning them because they don't keep the law, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls version says they don't keep the covenant, things like that. It's these are kind of nitpicks, like the scholars who understand the issues and all of the challenges to textual preservation. Scholars themselves are amazed. They would, putting it in lay terms, would say, yeah, it's word for word identical. That's pretty cool and amazing.
Right.
But
And, and also in Wesley's defense, not that he needs my defense, he's not an Old Testament scholar. He's not a literal, scientist or whatever the right terminology is. He's not uh, Dr. Michael Heiser, right?
well,
He's a New Testament guy, and I'm looking at his website. So he's currently doing a PhD in the New Testament at Wycliffe College.
but he is a critical textual scholar, isn't
That's
he?
not. He doesn't present himself as that.
Huh.
He
But
says that he holds a BA in sociology, Masters of Theology. He's doing his PhD in the New Testament, but he describes himself as an apologist and I was just looking at the other things that it says about him, but he doesn't present himself as a textual historian or a critical analyst or any of those kinds of
Hmm.
words. He doesn't use those to describe himself. So I think that's,
Okay.
you got to take a guy at his own, on his website where he's telling you who he is and why you should book him and bring him in and do all these things. He doesn't say I'm a textual critic. So
Yeah. I have another point I wanted to kind of,
sure.
if you guys are done with the Isaiah
Yeah.
stuff. I don't have anything else to add to it. I
Well,
think it's
I was just going to say about it, the criticisms that people have used to kind of, take away from what what I think was the fantastic work that Wes did on the Joe Rogan Experience, um, is
yeah,
that
just to be clear, like, just Wes Huff is like our hero. Like, he's a rock star. We're not.
absolutely
If we're whatever criticism, I do have some criticisms, but they're nitpicks. They're like, this was an awesome thing, and I'm like, not. It went
he's a net good, and he moved the ball
yeah
forward.
like a
absolutely.
like a 99.87% net good.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think the nitpicks are you know, grasping at straws almost to a certain degree, right? It's like, oh yeah, well he said word for word, and I can prove that it's not exactly word for word. And I'm like, well, I mean, I guess we'd have to get in. I feel like I'm turning into Jordan Peterson, and it's like, what does word for word mean? You know, because
Yeah.
what Wes meant when he said it, and I think you said this a minute ago, Brian. I just wanted to restate it. He was attempting to have a conversation with Joe Rogan. Like
Yeah.
he was sitting in a room chilling. Joe's dropping F bombs on his side of the microphone, being Joe. And Wes knows this guy that he's coming to talk to is not a Christian, is, increasingly more Christian curious.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think Wes had a goal of one, doing a 99% good job on the largest podcast on planet Earth to reach the biggest audience possible, and to do it in a way that was, light enough that he didn't get bogged down in the
Yeah.
muck and mire of technicalities of theological wizards duels, and just keep the conversation going. And I think that's what he was trying to do. And I
Yeah.
think he did a fantastic job of it.
And for years, like every time, I don't like watch every podcast Joe Rogan does, but I've watched
Nor
quite
I.
a number of them. And over the years, if every time he like Christianity comes up on the show, if there was a way for Joe Rogan to be objectively wrong, he was like, and it was like every dumb cliche that non-Christians throw out, like Constantine invented the Bible, and you can't know what's in there because it's a bunch of oral tradition that went through the telephone game and then got written
And that was
down.
actually the point of him bringing up the Isaiah scroll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
'Cause
100%.
like we're
Yeah,
talking about
absolutely.
1,000 years,
Yeah.
1,000 years, and it says the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing lost in translation with the telephone game, as people will try to discredit the Bible all the time.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I would like, for years, I have been writing to the Joe Rogan show, like pleading with them, like, you guys, I love you guys. You suck on this topic. You need to get somebody credible. You need to get William Lane Craig on there. Um, and and at one point there was actually like a Christian petition to
Yeah.
do that, but which would still be awesome, but I kind of like, I don't feel the urgency to it. Uh, Dre, were you yawning or were you scowling at my
I was
idea of William
yawning. I
Lane
was
Craig?
yawning. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
it looked like you're like, ew, William Lane Craig, not him.
I don't like people with three names.
Well,
They always shoot presidents. They
That's
always do
right.
it.
That's right.
in fairness, I think Wes fit the vibe of the JRE more than William Lane Craig would.
Yeah, and that did occur to me. It would be an interesting juxtaposition to see him like interviewing William Lane Craig, because he's like William Lane Craig is so he's very professional, he's very focused, he doesn't really banter much, he's just kind of
Exactly.
down to
Yeah.
business. And but yeah, so
Who,
with that said,
who's that other that Cliff Neckel?
Cliff Nechtel,
That dude would be good on Joe Rogan.
yeah, the guy who goes to college campuses.
Yeah, and does like hand-to-hand combat
Yeah.
with all the angry
Yeah,
kids that think they're smarter than him.
that's yeah. So with all of that praise um, in mind,
Now that we've set the stage that we like Wes,
but
brace
You see
yourself.
that
Brace
Alex
yourself.
O'Connor has one of those me against 25 Christians?
I haven't watched
I
it.
haven't watched it
I
yet.
haven't watched it either.
So he did. Alex O'Connor did have a decent point, but then he went and wildly overstated it, which is where Wes Huff mentioned how Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God, which I know he was just sort of like kind of giving kind of a collapsed version of the story of Jesus' ministry. But this is something that like Christians often say, and it drives me up the wall, that that Jesus's message was simply, I'm God, believe in me. Wes Huff didn't say this, but I do think it's a wild overstatement to say that Jesus was just going around audaciously claiming to be God. And it kind of sets the stage for like Muslim critics of Christianity to say, where did Jesus claim to be God?
Mm-hmm.
And there are places where there are things he said that if you understand them, they can only be taken to mean he's claiming to be God. Um, Alex O'Connor says that these claims to divinity only happen in John's gospel, which, as far as the explicit claims, he's right. Um, in the synoptics, you don't have Jesus. And just to be clear, I am not saying that in the synoptic gospels Jesus is not presented to be God or doesn't think of himself as being God. I'm saying that the synoptic gospels they were written in a different genre than John's gospel. John's gospel was written more as a kind of a Socratic dialogue. You have more of his one-on-one conversations with people. Some of them are in private, some are in public, but there's still dialogues with him. There's like a dialectic between him and a questioner, him and an opponent. In the synoptics, it's more his public teachings. And what you find in the synoptics is that when he's doing things to indicate that he is the Messiah, but he's not claiming to be the Messiah explicitly. When people realize correctly that he is the Messiah, he doesn't correct them for sure, but he does tell them, don't tell anyone.
Right.
Um,
Most famously was when he expelled the demons,
yeah,
and when they saw him and instantly were like, "Oh no, we know
yeah,
who you are." He was like, "Shut up."
yeah, exactly. And so what is implicit in the synoptic gospels is often made explicit in John's gospel because it's a different genre and it's less about his public teachings and more about kind of my own personal pet theory is that it was written after the temple fell, and it's essentially about the temple, and with that perspective on Jewish history, John is kind of like he's kind of retelling the Jesus' story and his teachings in light of the fall of the temple to kind of make these things work that were implicit in the synoptic gospels explicit in John's gospel. And the whole point is that Jesus and his disciples after him are the new temple. And so he's kind of, and I'm not saying he invented language. I'm saying that he emphasized those conversations that Jesus had, like with Nicodemus, the woman at the well, that kind of and organize it around that point. Whereas the synoptic gospels were much more kind of straightforward ancient biographies. But because we go into it with this idea that Jesus was going around claiming to be God, we kind of miss a lot of what he's really talking about there. Sorry, I kicked the chair and now I vibrated my anyway, but like when he, and I've said this on the podcast before, but it's one of those things that's so oft overlooked that it's worth repeating. When Jesus talked about the Son of Man, he was not talking about himself in the third person in his audience's understanding. He was referencing this concept that already existed in Jewish culture of the Messiah. When an ancient Jew in the first century heard the phrase the Son of Man, what they heard was the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
This harkened back to the Daniel's vision in chapter 7 where he sees the four beasts, and then the four beasts are stripped of power, the fourth beast is destroyed, and then and it's a scene of the divine council. And then he says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. So this figure, son of man at the time just meant a guy. Coming on the clouds of heaven meant divinity. And so this is a human and he is divine. The Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. So he's a distinct figure from God is led into the presence of God, where he's given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, men of every language worshipped him. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is one that will never pass away. So this is clearly a divine human being who is afforded the honors of God in the presence of God. He's afforded honors in the presence of God that are only appropriate to God. So he's clearly a divine human being in the book of Daniel. And then when you read the book of Enoch, the book of parables, it's all about this figure, this son of man who is the Messiah. And a lot of Jesus' language that you find in the gospels, it's drawn directly from the book of Enoch, specifically book 2, the book of parables, like all the stuff about the son of man coming in his father's glory with in the power of the angels, has all the nations gathered before him. Um, when the Son of Man comes in glory, all of that language was already kind of established before Jesus got there. So that's what he's invoking when he says the kingdom of God is at hand. This is synonymous with the coming of the Son of Man. He wasn't saying, when I come in power, when I come in, we understand in hindsight that he is the Son of Man, that he was talking about himself, but he wasn't saying that directly. He wasn't just like spoon feeding that to his audience. He was trying to get them to understand that that the the Son of Man's rule was imminent, as evidenced in the miracles he's doing. But the question was, and then he sent his disciples out, delegating the same authority to them, where they also forgave sins and drove out demons and raised the dead and did all the things he was doing. And the point, so, you know, to read that as if he's just kind of spoon feeding them that message, I'm God, believe in me, you're kind of missing a lot of it. And so, and this is less a criticism of Wes Huff for saying that, and more of a like taking what he said as an opportunity to correct this kind of popular misunderstanding that that a lot of Christians have. So
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think it gets lost in those conversations because it's always an all or nothing. It's a very zero sum kind of thing. Either he said it or he didn't, right? And that's usually where that argument comes into play. And I think that's why it becomes problematic because it's an argument, and you like you pointed out that like a Muslim critic or an atheist, they're trying to have a gotcha moment, and they're like, oh yeah, well he never said it, and then the only counter is to go, uh-huh. Not only did he say it, look how many times he said it, look how often he said it, right? Rather than say, well, there's a nuance here you have to understand, and to understand that you've got to understand, you have to put yourself in the mind of an ancient Near Eastern, and all
or
of that stuff that we've said 1,000 times and
yeah,
laughed about because it's like almost a trope to say it, but it's still true.
or but even before like that's certainly helpful, but just reading it as a narrative, like even without that ancient, without putting yourself in the headspace
Hmm.
of an ancient person, but just reading it as a narrative on its own terms, you get that. We Christians typically read it in verses.
Hmm.
Show me the verse, and
Yep.
then we kind of take that
Yep.
verse and we build a whole theology on one
Yep.
verse. When it's a bit more, it requires, we like shortcuts. um it's like we see the Bible as homework, and we just want to kind of get through it and just give me the answers.
What do you mean
To
it's like we see it as homework? It is homework to most. You know how many times I've heard people talking about, read the Bible in a year, and there's all these apps to help you do it because
Yeah.
it's something that every Christian should aspire to. And then, the joke is every Christian gets all the way to Leviticus and then they bog down because it's so terrible to read as a book, right? And then they don't get any further. Um, yeah, it's a weird thing. Admittedly, I've never read the Bible cover to cover. Like, I'm not sure I've read the entire Bible. I'll be really honest. Like, there's a couple of books that I'm like, where is that? They're like, it's a book in the Bible, and I'm like, it is? I'm not
Shame on
sure I've
you.
heard of it. I mean, it's just the reality of it. It's not.
When I was leading the young adults group of that church that eventually kicked me out, um and we would talk about this topic, I would tell them, look, if you're following Jesus Christ, if he is, if you're going to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, if he's your God, and you want to be his disciple and deny yourself, take up your cross daily and follow him, you can't afford to do that and not read the Bible. That's your basic operating system. You need to understand it in its entirety, as a whole narrative, not just the parts that prop up your theology.
Hmm.
So if you haven't read, if it's, and usually people are like, well, I don't have time, and I've got this and another this and that going on, and it's just so hard to make time to do it. I tell them, well, if that's really why, then
It's a prioritization issue, and you
then
put your money where your mouth is.
well, I usually tell them, if that's really the reason, then you need to quit your job or whatever. Or if you're in college, drop out of college for a year, whatever it is you're doing, whatever your main vocation is, stop that, read the Bible. And they're usually like, wow, that's crazy. What are you talking about? Well, I don't think you really don't have time. I think you have the
Right.
same amount of time everybody has, but it's if you are a Christian, that is the most important thing you need to be doing right now.
Yep. In fact,
And
I
so,
just looked. I can tell you, I've never read the book of Obadiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, or Haggai. I'm not
well,
sure I've looked at a single verse in any of those books. I can
I'm
just tell. I'm just looking at it, like I know I've read up until that point. I've read Daniel, I've read Hosea,
I'm
and I've
almost
definitely
excited.
read Jonah.
I'm almost excited for you because you get to do this for the first time. But the way that I always do it when I do read through the Bible, I read through the historical books, and then when I reach that point in the timeline in the history books where a particular prophet was active, I go and I read that prophet in the context of those
No,
events,
totally fair.
and because he's commenting on those
Right.
events, and
And
it
and
actually,
and that's how I read the Bible also. I just
yeah,
haven't got to a point that one of these were cross-referenced at this
yeah,
point, right? Because I've read the parts of the Bible that I've read. I'd like to think I actually have a pretty decent understanding of what I've read. You know what I mean? But like if you had told me 5 minutes ago that there's a book in the Bible called Nahum, I would not have believed you. I should have been like, okay, is that one of
have,
the Ethiopian books?
have you read Second Hezekiah?
I think I have. I mean, I can't quote it, but I think I
I'm
have.
sorry, that was
Like second Hezekiah.
that was a
Okay.
mean joke. There's
Yeah.
no Second Hezekiah.
My point is, when I know that there's a book that I've never heard the name before, I'm pretty sure I
Yeah,
haven't read it. And like I said,
yeah.
Nahum,
There's not even a first Hezekiah.
there's not a Hezekiah.
There's a guy named Hezekiah, but he doesn't have a book named after him.
Oh, there's a Haggai and a Zechariah.
What a loser.
There's a Zephaniah.
He doesn't even have his own book.
Yeah.
Why do I care about him? Like why?
Um. Well, he's covered in Isaiah, but yeah, but doing it that way.
But is he covered word for word?
See what you did there.
You know, something we've never talked. I don't know if we've talked about it before. We've talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls a couple of times. The most heartbreaking part of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was that the people that found it were some goat herders, some kids, and they
Yeah.
were throwing rocks at these because the scrolls were inside of like vases,
Yeah.
and
Some
they were
clay
throwing
pots.
rocks at them and breaking them. They were just being kids,
Yeah.
and they destroyed some of the manuscripts that were in those. And we have no idea how many they destroyed before they finally told some adults what was in there.
Yeah. That is pretty. Codex Sinaiticus has a similar story.
Does it?
Yeah. According to, well, there's some debate over whether Constantine von Tischendorf wrote to, I don't remember who he wrote this to, but he basically claimed that when he got to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, they were using leaves from Codex Sinaiticus for kindling. And
It's a similar story for the Nag Hammadi library as well,
Hmm.
where because they were looking for lost goats and they were jumping through the caves trying to find their damn goat, and they brought it back, and their mom's like, oh, sweet, give me that. I'm cooking dinner. And started like burning these things.
Yeah.
And
That's
they're all,
crazy.
what's interesting is they're all found kind of around the same time, 1945, right? Like,
Yeah, and
as if it's on purpose or something like that.
it is. I mean, it kind of makes you wonder how many discoveries would, like, if there had been a formal discipline of archaeology earlier, if what kind of discoveries might have been made. But
Where was Indiana Jones when we needed him?
yeah.
Or what
What
discoveries were just destroyed because all the dirt fell on it, or
yeah.
Yeah.
and they're so ancient, they were brittle, and lots of the books are not intact. There's just scrolls with like
Yeah.
fragments
Right.
all over the place.
Sometimes I pray that somebody right now is discovering like the lost writings of Papias of Hierapolis, or the recovered manuscripts of the book of Jashar, or the book of the Wars of Yahweh, or any of these books that you find reference in the
Right.
Bible that are outside the Bible, that we don't
Well,
have anymore.
the easy conspiracy theory is they already were, maybe. They're down in the Vatican.
Yeah. Well, I don't like to.
You don't like to what?
I, I don't like to fuel conspiracy theories like you find in the Dan Brown novels. What the reason I don't believe that is that the
Indiana Jones started that conspiracy theory before that. At
did
the
he?
end of the Ark of the Covenant, when they just locked it away with all the other stuff.
Well, that's not a text though. That's an artifact.
It's
But
the
that's
Ark of the Covenant. It's like God's inside that box.
well, um, I, the premise of that conspiracy theory is that the Vatican doesn't want you to know the truth.
Right.
They want, like, the Bible is like the official Vatican version of
Right.
Christianity that they've just fed us, and it's highly curated. But if you know the history of the Bible and the Roman Catholic Church's relationship with the Bible, and their history of withholding it from the common people, keeping it in Latin so that they, to kind of maintain the monopoly they had on it. The
Shout out
Bible,
Erasmus.
yeah, the Bible itself was scandalous to the Roman Catholic status quo. That's the thing they didn't want people to get. And they did a pretty good job of keeping it out of people's hands until the printing press came along.
Yeah.
Um,
But
but
that follow-on theory is more about things they found since, right? And the theory to pull on that thread is that it's not so much, at least the way I embrace the theory, the conspiracy theory is not so much that the things that are hidden under the Vatican would undermine the Bible. It's that they would undermine the Roman Catholic Church. Those are two very different things, because the Roman Catholic Church has a lot of influence, power, and money tied to it.
So you're saying they would illuminate the Bible?
Yes.
And the Catholics are like,
Yes.
we don't need that because we have the monopoly on the Bible.
The way my little the conspiracy theory in my head is that it would basically shine a holy light on Catholicism in a way that it would no longer exist.
the thing
And
is,
Protestantism would become more powerful.
I think the Bible already does that on its own, though. Like if you just sit down and read the book of
Especially
Judges,
if you don't have the extra 6-8 books that the Catholics have in their Bible. I feel like we don't give that enough attention. That we talk about, canon this and the Ethiopians that. Is like the Catholics have a whole other set of books that we don't have, and no one ever says a word about that. Like, well, it's not talked about.
We have it. We just don't consider it canon. Like it would, like the original King James version had those. Like it's not like a.
I'm not suggesting they're a secret. I'm suggesting that we consider them to be non-canon and they don't. Like, and with all of the rules that you and I have gotten, like in red-faced arguments about what's canon and what's not and why and how, like it's stunning to me that Catholics just run around with extra books and that Protestants don't constantly bring it up. Like anytime that there's this like, Protestant v Catholic debates that are on, like how does that just not become the center of the conversation? Like
I
we
don't think
can't
it.
move forward until we deal with
Where'd
these
you
extra
where,
books.
where'd you get that idea in your extra book?
Exactly. That's how everybody shits on, Mormonism. Oh, because of your
Exactly. Yeah.
golden discs, right? And it goes from there and it falls apart. The conversation, derails. But
Speaking of,
but we never do that with Catholic versus Protestantism, and
well,
I find it incomprehensible.
I have thoughts about that, but I'm afraid like there's some important Wes Huff, Alex O'Connor stuff that we still need to
Oh
get
yeah,
into.
I didn't mean to fully
Like
derail us. It was just
the eyewitnesses.
it was a conversation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the witnesses.
Yeah. So Wes Huff makes mention of the 400 witnesses, but
Whoops.
he meant to say 500 witnesses
Yeah.
that Paul references in 1 Corinthians 15. And Alex O'Connor, he spent the bulk of the his initial rebuttal. I don't know what he said since then, or if he's retracted or doubled down on stuff. Um, and again, this is kind of nitpicking Wes Huff. Um, because he didn't prepare for this and he didn't know how it was going to come up. But and I think so. I'm trying to like sum this up to streamline it a bit so I can jump into it. Wes Huff mentions the 500 witnesses. Alex O'Connor he kind of dismissed that because we don't know anything about these 500 witnesses and what did they really he kind of goes into the weeds a bit about what did they see and how do we know they saw Jesus and how did 500 people even see him at once, and it kind of struck me that like he wasn't really dealing with with the evidence as it is and following where it leads. It seemed like he was just trying to justify his unbelief, um, with whatever support he could find. The significant, like he's kind of dealing with it as if Wes Huff said that as if to tell us, hey, there were 500 people who saw the risen Jesus. And again, Wes Huff, I think he could have kind of explained this a little better, but again, I've had time to think about this and he didn't. The importance of that is not that Paul is telling us that there were 500 witnesses. The importance of that is that that didn't even come from Paul. Paul was citing a creed, like that there were 500 witnesses was part of the creed that Paul himself had received and had used to initiate some of the Corinthians, and he was just reminding them of that. And the reason that's important, so he tells them, tells the Corinthians, now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you, otherwise you believe in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So that's how you know that's your first clue that this is not from Paul. This is a formal creed that Paul had received. That because that's the language of received rabbinical tradition. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. And then he delivers the creed, and it's this formulaic structure that the Messiah died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised again on the third day according to the scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Cephas being Peter. Um, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at the same time. And then Paul adds his own commentary, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to me also, dot, 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 dot. Whether then it was I or they, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So he's reminding the Corinthians that he used this creed to initiate them. But it wasn't just him, it was whether then it was I or they. Well, the they he's talking about are the people mentioned in that creed. Cephas, the 12, probably some of the 500. James, all the apostles. Um, And this is kind of reinforced by the fact that he starts his letter by rebuking them for forming cliques around which apostle or teacher had initiated them. It's reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is that some of you say, I follow Paul, others I follow Cephas, others I follow Apollos, others I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? And then he spends the next few chapters kind of laying into them for 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 their divisions and for forming cliques around which person had initiated them, because it doesn't matter which of them initiated them, because it's the same message. They're all just workmen working for the same cause. So all of that's irrelevant. And then he makes some off the cuff remarks in chapter 9 about the travel habits of Cephas and the Lord's brothers, as if these were people known to the Corinthians. And all of that is to say that this, like, to what we get from that, the reason all of that is important from an historical standpoint, is that this establishes that not just Paul, but Cephas, the 12 apostles, lots of other people were going around the Roman Empire, or beyond that, the Mediterranean world, and initiating people into the faith with this creed. And just for some perspective, before the advent of Christianity, there was already the Jewish diaspora. There were communities of Jews spread out around the Mediterranean world, throughout the Roman Empire, and the early Christian movement kind of piggybacked on that. They would go to synagogues where Jews were and preach the gospel there first, and there was always this kind of like Jewish core to the original churches, and then Gentiles came in. Um, and so there was, throughout the Jewish diaspora had a pretty active network of communication back to their homeland, back to Judea. And there was, people would send letters back and forth, and people would travel there for pilgrimages, which you read about in the Gospels, when there were pilgrims in town for Passover. And then in the book of Acts, there were all kinds of pilgrims from all of the nations there on Pentecost. And that's probably how the Church of Rome started, actually, because pilgrims who were there when the Holy Spirit came on Pentecost became Christians, and then they went back to Rome. But bottom line is, you had this network of communication among Jews, among Christians around the Mediterranean world. And so when somebody from Judea shows up and says, the Messiah has come, he is our rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, and then they initiate them with this creed, claiming that there are 500 witnesses, and people are hearing that, well, people are going to ask questions about that. That's the natural response. Um, so the bottom line is that the purpose of that is not, and by the way, this is not my whole case here. This is just kind of the setup, and I'm kind of laying this out there so you guys can ask questions or challenge or whatever. But the bottom line is, the original disciples of Jesus were making this claim within the living memory of people who were there. And that claim included, Jesus rose again from the dead and appeared to us. He appeared to 500 people at one time. Um, it wasn't just some off the cuff remark from Paul. It was part of the formal creed by which all Christian leaders initiated people into the faith. And that's a pretty huge piece of historical evidence. Now, it doesn't necessarily automatically in one step go from that to there were 500 witnesses and that proves the resurrection. But if you want to say that they made it up, or they were hallucinating, or whatever other alternative you offer for the existence of Christianity other than that Jesus rose from the dead, well, you have to do something with that. You have to explain how were they able to go around making this audacious claim that 500 people saw the risen Jesus.
Well, I mean, I guess I I found the whole line of conversation, or debate or attack or argument or whatever it is that Alex O'Connor was presenting, I found it really weird and odd. And the reason for me to feel that way about it was I've never really considered that comment, that thing in the Bible to be that relevant. Like all the things you just said, I'm respectfully going, so? And my point is that if you're coming at this from an apologetics perspective, right? And you've done a remarkable job on this show a handful of times explaining, the case for the resurrection.
Thanks.
But the case for the resurrection in no way in my mind hinges on Jesus appearing to the multitudes. Like that's, to me, it's a footnote to the case for the resurrection. So like, I feel like you could make that case without it or with it or whatever. Like the other parts are so much more important. Drake, go ahead. I'm curious what your thoughts on what I just said. Because I realized what I said.
Right. So because I think it's way more relevant.
Okay.
Because if it was just his circle of friends saying it, then all of the criticism that we use today, where we just say, yeah, that guy's friends are saying that this is true. And if you love someone enough, or if you're in your little death cult, you're not worried about being persecuted. Because that's another argument we have, right? These guys they're either liars or they're, maybe they're facing death.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have somebody who is not part of the circle see the same thing and testify to it.
And testify, but none of the 500 are testifying in the Bible. We don't have a firsthand account of the 500.
Valid. But I would assume that they did because of what Brian said. We received this, and there was Paul's talking about it, of course the disciples were giving it, but there's kind of an illusion that the 500 were also, they became disciples and did the same thing.
Sure. I mean, I definitely would think that these people became some of the early Christians, right? Like that's an assumption that I go with. Yeah, no problem there. Because the reality is, numerically, for Christianity to grow to the size that it did in the time span that it didn't start at 12, right? Like 12 doesn't turn into tens of thousands to millions.
Yeah.
You need to start with a material number that then can start multiplying out. And it makes sense to say there was 500-ish, and then those 500 all went and told 10 people. And now you've got, 5,000 people. Now, the snowball is spinning. I think that's...
Well, you read in the book of Acts that there were 120 people there with them on the day of Pentecost who were already disciples. And so the church started in Jerusalem, but when you read the resurrection accounts, Jesus really wanted them to go to Galilee. He wasn't planning to appear to the disciples as a group in Jerusalem. The angels told them, they told the women, go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is risen. He was gone ahead of you into Galilee. Go there and you will see him. And this is kind of repeated, go to Galilee, go to Galilee, but they won't go because they don't believe it. So then Jesus appears and says, and he rebukes them for not having any faith, because he had told them that he was going to rise from the dead. But Thomas wasn't there, and so then he appears again to them a week later with Thomas there, and then they finally go to Galilee, and you get that in Matthew's gospel when they go to Galilee, and it says that the 11 saw him, but some doubted. It doesn't say the 500 there, but I think that's the best candidate for when the 500 were there. Like, just because they're not mentioned, like the emphasis is on the disciples going to Galilee in obedience to the command. and then seeing him, and that's where they get the Great Commission. But I think the reason that he wanted them to go to Galilee was that that's where he was most active. That's where most of the people who had known him and had received his teachings, and that's where most of them were. And so he wanted to appear to all of them collectively. Um, but to kind of respond to what both of you have said, I think that just the 12 alone would, just their testimony would be enough to establish that, as the only logically permissible conclusion from the data, just from the 12, would be that he rose from the dead. I think the 12 as witnesses. I'll wait for Dre to come back on. So, because hey Dre, I was kind of, I didn't know if you could hear me or not while I was
Yeah, I could.
talking.
Just go ahead.
Like, did you hear before?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, I think the 12 as the witnesses were there enough to establish that he rose from the dead. But the fact that they also mentioned 500 witnesses also saw him, well, now as they're going around preaching this kind of exposes them to a lot of, if they're not telling the truth and they're claiming there are 500 people who can back this up, and there aren't sufficient numbers of people that they can deliver on that. Well, now that's going to expose them. That's going to be
Sure.
that's
No,
going to
I'm
undermine their message. And
I'm not
so
suggesting that the claim is irrelevant, right? Or that it's a that it has no value in the total conversation. I just don't see it as being the linchpin. It's not the aha moment or the gotcha thing,
it
or
strengthens it. It's
it does. But my point is, if you take it away, it doesn't fall apart. Is
I,
the point
I
that I'm making?
I agree with that.
That's what I'm trying to say, at least in my view, right? And Dre, you might feel differently, but I found it weird that he instantly, Alex O'Connor, he, you know, drew this immediate allusion to the situation at Fatima, right? The big thing back in the '60s, I guess it was, or whatever. Um,
also the golden plates, but you're going to get to that.
Yeah, but to use that, it was like he was trying to create this either or scenario where, well, if you believe in that, then I guess you got to be Catholic, and it's like, wait, okay, that's a whole different conversation. And by the way, your boy Cameron glammed onto
And
that
and a
in a big
different
way,
phenomenon as well. Like it's
right? But the point was is that there were multiple people that claimed to have experienced it.
sure.
But
Yeah,
the trick to that, and I don't want to get into turn this into a Fatima conversation, but like there was no consistency with what was seen or experienced, right, by all the people there. So there was a whole bunch of different stories, and there was a whole bunch of people that said they didn't see anything. I can't see shit, right? Like there was people that said that about it. Um, so like to try to use that as a weird aha gotcha moment was kind of weird, I thought. But I didn't think it did much. That was
well,
just my whole takeaway. Like I'm listening to Alex go through this, and I'm like, I don't even get the point you're trying to make, because like,
and what I notice about that is that he doesn't seem interested at all in explaining. Okay, well, how on your worldview, Alex, how do you explain what happened at Fatima? How do you explain the golden
mhm,
plates? How do you explain the 500 witnesses? How do you explain that this creed exists and that the people who knew Jesus were going around claiming to have to have witnessed this? You
mhm,
you just kind of blow that off and look for whatever out you can to dismiss it and not be a believer when, like, I don't you're not dealing with the data. You're kind of trying to lawyer the data away and excuse yourself from dealing with it. And that's kind of a typical, like, atheist tactic. They're not like they're more interested in justifying their unbelief and just dismissing any consideration of the evidence than with actually explaining the evidence. Because when you pin them down, well, how do you explain that the disciples, because we have it as a matter of historical fact that you can't get away from, that the people who knew Jesus were made this claim to have collectively, repeatedly, and empirically encountered him alive again after his public execution and burial. They all claim to have heard the same set of instructions. They were all equal in authority and influence and power, so nobody was getting rich, powerful, or laid out of this. Um, so what do you do with that?
Right.
And typically, like they just avoid the question altogether. But the only once you're confronted with that question and you have to do something with it, if you don't think that it's either and this is true of any claim to empirical experience that anybody ever has, whether it's the angel Moroni gave me some golden plates to translate, or the garden gnomes in my front yard are talking to me, or I got abducted by aliens, or the angel Gabriel came to me and gave me a new religion and said I'm a prophet now. Whatever it is, it's the fact that somebody makes the claim to empirical experience, it always absolutely necessarily logically demands that one of three things has to be true. Either it really happened as they said it did, they made it up, which people do, or they're honestly mistaken. Maybe they're crazy. Maybe they saw something and mistook it for something else. Maybe they hallucinated, whatever. But one of those three things absolutely has to be true anytime there is somebody makes a claim like that. And it's a matter of historical fact that they made that claim. And so what do you do with it? And so if you don't accept that it happened, then you have to claim that they were either lying about it or they were somehow honestly mistaken. And when you explore either one of those two options, and I'm not going to like run through the whole argument against it, but to shorten this, you have you have to you have to believe absurd things to maintain either one of those two things. When you examine the evidence and the data and reason it out logically, the only reason to reject that it really happened is if you start out already knowing that God doesn't exist, that nothing transcends nature, so miracles can't happen, so there are no messiahs or prophets or miracles much or risen messiah. Like they reject it on the basis of their philosophical prejudices, not on the basis of the evidence. And so, but which is why they're never really interested in explaining what did happen. They just want to excuse themselves from the exercise. So I went on a bit there. And now I'm
Just
out
a
of
little
breath.
bit. We're fine. It's a thing.
Yeah. So I'm here.
Dre, did you have more thoughts on that? Because I know I think you got distracted in the middle of your responding to my crazy take.
No, I think what some of the arguments are, well, did any of it happen? Did they really run around and claim? Was this actually a claim? We keep saying that's a historical fact, that it's a claim. And I think people like, well, there's no proof that actually did or was a claim at that time, that it could have been a claim, later. Except that Paul kind of refutes that.
Right.
But
I think the weird thing is, to me, is when you get into trying to
or writings that do refute. I think Joe Rogan asked, is there anybody that said they're full of shit? And then but that that scroll got suppressed or whatever, or then I don't know. Like,
I think the other point is that, all of the times you hear somebody kind of go at the textual historicity of the Bible, right?
Right.
Is that, well, how do we know for sure? And it's like, well, how do we know for sure anything?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
do we know that Rome actually existed? How do we know for sure? Like, how do we know that Julius Caesar was really an emperor?
Yeah,
Like,
anything is possible.
right. At some
But
point, you have to put a little bit of belief in the fact that people just wrote stuff down, and you have to just accept it, that they wrote this stuff down because it meant something and it was
you
important.
have to make inferences to the best explanation of the
Right.
data. if you're just looking to validate the beliefs you came with, well, there are flat earthers who do that.
They do a really good job of it.
They are brilliant people. You have to
How do we know that Abraham Lincoln didn't slay vampires?
Right.
Can't prove he didn't.
Right. And there's nothing
Did the Civil
written that
War
said,
actually happen?
there's nothing written that said Abraham Lincoln never killed a vampire.
Do I know a slave?
For all we know, slavery itself is a hoax.
We
Never
said
happened.
something earlier. We were talking about tortured musicians. I forget how we were talking about that.
It's Kanye and his naked bride.
I heard a thing the other day that Vincent van Gogh died in 1943 or 63. 63. The dude is like contemporary.
Right.
And like in my mind, he's like he died in the 1800s
like
or something. Yeah, like I thought he was like crazy old. Like he listened to the Beatles. You know, he could have watched like professional wrestling. It's weird when you think about stuff like that. So like, we know that guy was real, but because one generation of people. But once you're past the generation of anything, it's all hearsay.
But even right now in this moment, the vast
Van Gogh died in 1890, Matt.
Then that's not who I'm thinking of. Then who am I thinking of? It was Van Gogh. Which one was it?
Picasso.
Maybe it was when did Picasso die? Maybe it was Pablo Picasso. It was one of the real famous artists.
Not Andy Warhol.
No, not Andy Warhol. No.
Picasso.
It's
Pablo
Picasso. He died in 73.
73.
Yeah, that's
okay. There we go. That's it.
Yeah. Thanks for the fact check, Jamie. Because I don't want anybody coming after. I don't want some artist coming after me.
This would be bad to be like,
Van Gogh.
I'm not watching that show ever again. Matt's a fucking idiot.
Vincent Van Gogh was alive in the 70s. Shut up.
Van Gogh, Picasso, potato, tomato.
One of those weird artist guys.
Art, okay.
But even right now, in the moment, 99.999% of what you know about the reality right now, you only know because other people have told you about it.
Agreed.
And even perspectives, right? So, I mean, my son was telling me there's a new Iraq war movie. Yeah, that's like your movie. That's like your war, right? And I have a very different perspective of OIF than so many veterans that were there on the ground.
You think about Generation Kill relative to the end of the war and how much different those were a generation apart.
Yes.
I mean, Generation Kill,
20 years.
Generation Kill, that's when you and I were there. They were still in green uniforms.
They were in the tent behind us. Right.
Yeah.
So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Mattis only had one star.
Was he the legend yet?
That's where he became a legend.
Right.
His legend was written.
Yeah.
He had 2 stars when he sat down next to me and asked me questions. And when he punched me.
I'm surprised
I got punched by that. I should have just beat his little ass. That's what I should have.
You're lucky that wasn't his knife hand.
Looking at you.
You should have picked him up and twirled him around and
because he's a little dude.
Did a backbreaker on him or something.
I met Krulak once. He was a little dude too.
He's a little guy also.
Yeah. But
a little guy.
To Joe Rogan's question, he was asking if there were people who, like, among those 500 witnesses who wrote down their experiences,
who spoke out
right.
And I think that would have been a really good opportunity to point out 2 things. One, the fact that there was nobody, there are no writings saying, hey, these guys are full of crap. And when you look at the nature of their claims, he's feeding 5,000 people, and that's pretty much in the public. He wrote in.
No one ever wrote a letter and said, I went to this wedding, I didn't get shit to eat because there wasn't enough food.
Well, but
and the wine sucked and they ran out.
but the nature of the gospel narratives are he's doing these spectacular miracles in full view of the public, and
Right.
the religious leaders, the societal rulers are witnessing this, and they're denouncing him for it, and this leads to his crucifixion. And then they show up in the very city in which he was crucified a matter of weeks later and say, you crucified the Messiah. And we know from the historical facts, we can read Tacitus and know that very soon after the crucifixion of Jesus, the church started in Jerusalem, in the very city in which he was crucified, and there were tensions with the. We don't get this from Tacitus, but we know this from Josephus. We know it in general. There were tensions with the local Jewish religious rulers.
And
There were tensions with the
right.
Romans, yet there are no writings that and there's lots of writings from people who hated Christians. Nobody's saying these guys made it all up. There's these healings didn't happen, these miracles didn't happen. Um, we threw his body into a common grave, and that's why the tomb was empty. Nobody is denouncing them. What we get from the Talmud centuries later is that he was a sorcerer, but the fact that they're making such high profile claims about powerful public figures and events witnessed by powerful public figures, and they're claiming 500 witnesses for the central miracle of Christianity, and there's all of their many opponents are totally silent on it. That is evidence in itself. But also, the you know Alex O'Connor would object that, well, the Gospels are written too late for any of that to, all the people were dead by then, except the Gospels preserve the oral testimonies given by the eyewitnesses. Like the stuff that you read in the Gospels, that's when the disciples were going around the Mediterranean world and initiating people with that creed that Paul reminds them of in 1 Corinthians 15. People would have had questions, and not necessarily even skeptical questions. Just tell us, hey, hey, Cephas, Peter, you're tell us more about him, and then he's going to tell these stories. And others among those 500 witnesses were also going around telling those stories, and we know some of their names from the Gospels, like Jairus, the synagogue ruler. There's like these little details where it mentions like. Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to carry Jesus' cross part of the way, and I think it's in Luke's gospel. I'm not sure which might be Mark's. Um, just mentions off the cuff Simon. He's the father of Rufus and Alexander. Well, who are Rufus and Alexander? We don't know who they are, but we do find mention of these guys named Rufus and Alexander in some of Paul's letters, where he's just doing these routine, like, hey, so and so from so and so's household says hi, they want to give so and so their greetings, and he opens and closes some of his letters that way, and he just kind of drops these names of people he's talking to. Well, Simon of Cyrene, as the father of Rufus and Alexander, was mentioned because the original audience knew those guys.
Right.
um, and there's all kinds of little details like that in the Gospels that indicate to us that these were the stories that were being presented to the early Christian communities. Their job as disciples was to memorize them, and then they would recite them in their services. And so then when the Gospels were written down at whatever point, it doesn't really matter when they were written down, although good arguments can be made that it's before 70 AD. But so if they're going around the Mediterranean world making these claims about things that were happening in Judea, um, there was enough communication in those communities with the people in Judea that they could check, that they could verify these things. And if they were just making stuff up, casting high profile public figures in a bad light, um, they had the means to correct the record and even retaliate if they wanted. So these things weren't. it'd be nice if we could verify them somehow today, but it's just ignorant to say that they couldn't do that then, or to suppose that they wouldn't have wanted to, because you do find this constant preoccupation with the eyewitness nature of the gospel. Um, they certainly cared about historical accuracy in the early churches, and that's reflected in that constant preoccupation with the disciples, as in the Greek it's martyrion, which is where we get martyr, which just means witness, and that was a secular, like, legal historical term, not a religious one. It just meant somebody who gave testimony.
Mm.
That is a prime value in early Christianity because of the eyewitness nature of their claims about Jesus. And so they're just the way that everything is packaged, from claiming that there are 500 witnesses to their preoccupation with witnesses and eyewitness testimony. It's not just that that you could investigate them. They were inviting you to. They were presenting it in terms that insisted upon it. So
Yeah, they certainly weren't hiding or attempting to. It doesn't seem in any way that they were attempting to make it difficult to fact check them.
yeah. So
Community notes.
Right?
We don't fact
Oh,
check.
so speaking of Joe Rogan, because you said that, Dre, I don't know if you guys have listened to the or watched the Mark Zuckerberg JRE.
I haven't.
So Mark was on, I think, last week,
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
and he said, I thought it was crazy. He goes, uh, Twitter did a better job than we did when it came to this, because he was basically saying how they got fact checking wrong, and they spent way too much time trying to go after this and blah blah blah. And he's like, X just opened it up to the community and let them fact check themselves, and it all goes in the notes, and you can see it, and you kind of figure out when everybody agrees that this guy got it wrong, and everybody just moves on. And he goes, and it's a lot better because it's out in the open, and it's not the secretive machine doing it in the background and not giving you a say.
You
Anyway,
don't get you don't get a notice, 5
yeah.
minutes later telling you that you're in Facebook jail because
Yeah, I
you
only brought it up because it was a
offended somebody.
JRE event and we were just talking
Yeah.
about it, and then Dre said community notes. But I thought it was a really good interview. I recommend that one also. Zuckerberg seems to have learned a lot of lessons.
Or or he sees the writing on the wall and knows he
Sure,
better.
and he talks about that. That Joe, because Joe calls him out on that. He's like, I mean, some people are saying you just did this because of the election. He goes, look, is it a good time to change policy during an election? No. Is it a good time to do it before? No. Is it a good time to do it after? No. It's never a good time. He goes, so like, what am I supposed to do? Never make changes because people are gonna say I'm cherry picking and I'm doing it to, earn favor with Trump. Like, I mean, I saw a need to change and I made the change. I thought that was a valid point. Also, he's like, I could have never done it. Would that be better?
right.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt, but I wasn't born yesterday, so I'm not going to, because like he knows if he didn't make changes, he's doomed. Like, he's just like
I doubt he's doomed.
well,
Mark
I
Zuckerberg might be a lot of things. Doomed is probably not one of them.
well he could either make changes, or
His platform could be doomed.
they could be imposed upon him, and
I
so
mean, there's
he's
billions on it, so
Like, I think when him and Joe were talking about it, I think a third of planet Earth uses Facebook at least once a month.
yeah.
that's wide. That's wild. That's
It's
I mean,
it's so crazy.
he's never going to be flipping burgers.
Mm-mm.
That's not my point. But he doesn't want, he'd rather do the reforms himself than have them imposed on him by.
Or Brian, he was a young kid, never ran a big billion-dollar, social media platform before because nobody has, and he learned a bunch of lessons, and he's growing up, and he's making shifts.
It's entirely possible.
Right?
I'm not.
I get it. I mean, I'm not gonna like go to him for like advice and whatever, but at the same time, like, I mean, there really was never a Facebook before, so there's no precedent here. There's no book to read to know how to do this or not do it, right? And he was super young.
He was super young 4 years ago.
relative to what he's running, he's still super young.
He's talking about his policies over the past 4 years. Like,
No, further than that, since 2016.
All right. Well,
so he talks about the two big events. It was Trump's first election and coronavirus, and those were when everything went different, and nothing's ever been the same since on social media.
He was like cruising along, and then he's like,
that's kind of how he describes it.
Yeah.
He was like, everything was fine, and then the Trump stuff started, and then coronavirus happened. And he talks about with coronavirus that he said he has transcripts of emails where basically his employees are being threatened by people in the White House. Like, you will do this. And they're like, no, the hell we won't. And they're like, and he said they were getting phone calls and getting screamed at. And people are hanging up on people, and it was wild.
See, that fact alone, especially in my business, right? Like, it makes me crazy. Like that fact alone should have had people up in arms at the White House. Like that is it just shows what kind of submissive little cucks we are to the government, where like, well, I mean, yeah, they were doing the right thing though, so we should just have the government suppress us completely, and then bring in the fascist Donald Trump.
Il Donaldo.
Yeah, what's fascism?
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
It's gosh.
Right. Yeah, so we probably don't want to go down that route. Although I also want to point out that Pablo Picasso could have heard Aerosmith Dream On before he passed.
He probably did.
It was a big deal.
It wasn't that big of a deal at that time. It's one of those songs that got bigger later.
Yeah.
But
yeah, their first album came out in January of '73, and he passed in March of '73. So he might have been chilling in his.
He died April 8th, 1973.
Was it April? April. Oh,
I'm looking at it.
Well, what source are you looking at? Because Mark Zuckerberg in his community notes told me that it was March.
Well, okay.
So, do we have any more points on Mr. Huff and all the atheists that hate him?
I mean, we could probably do it. We could probably do this all day.
Yeah, for sure.
I had a note card, but I covered all my notes that I.
Apologia has a whole episode on the Gospel of John, according to Wes Huff. I don't know if we get into that, but and he brings a Bible scholar that teaches at Chapel Hill, the same place that Bart Ehrman teaches. So it's like a New Testament scholar, and they wrote the new textbook, and they're actually giving a class, which I might take. I might take this class, this New Testament class.
Yeah,
and then.
I did note down. I was gonna just leave it alone, but since you brought up John, like there's a part where Alex O'Connor, he makes a big point about that there's there is, he doesn't call it I guess he sort of acknowledges it's a bit of a fringe hypothesis, but he points out all of this, what he thinks as like internal evidence that there was an original ending to John where and then the last chapter was added on later, the part where they go fishing and then he asked Peter 3 times if he loves him, and that was added on according to this argument based on all of these cues, and he kind of acknowledges that it's a debatable point, but his tone suggests that he kind of takes this as he just the kind of the smug triumphalism in his tone as he's delivering this hypothesis, even though he acknowledges that it's just a hypothesis, it's a fringe theory, but the fact that he's willing to take that with such certainty but dismiss anything a Christian believes if there's any kind of like way out that he can find whatsoever, any excuse not to attend to it, he'll do that, and he'll kind of look down on Christians for believing it when there's this level of uncertainty that he claims for it. Yet this thing, he's gonna plant his flag there, and I think it's kind of telling. But Matt, you look like you were looking something up.
Oh, I was scrolling. I was just scanning things to see if they aligned to that. I always tried to do that in the background, but I didn't have anything.
Hmm.
So, Mr. Huff, like, we're just nitpicking, man. So,
Oh, I was,
No,
I was,
good, good job.
I
no, I
was
think he
swinging at
killed
Alex
it.
O'Connor. But
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Alec, I think Wes killed it. Um, I think he's, set, and I think the bad news is he set his own niche. Now he's got to own this new celebrity that he's created for himself.
I would like to see him debate Alex O'Connor in person.
Hmm.
And by the way, like I'm kind of crapping on Alex O'Connor tonight. I actually have a lot of respect for him also.
Oh,
I,
I didn't have a problem with the way Alex went at any of this. I think he nitpicked some things, and I think that's what you do, especially when you're doing it on a monologue podcast where you don't have dialogue,
Right. And he
right?
just says, Christians make these claims. I don't think that claim is true, and here's
Yeah,
why.
I think he was being as fair in the way he was doing it. He could only address what was said, right? And he's like, hey, this is what he said. This is how I'm going to address it. I was actually more annoyed by how Cameron took this and ran with it than I
Well,
was Alex
all the
O'Connor.
Christians that attacked Huff, I
Well,
think.
what Cameron did was Cameron turned this into well, I mean, Alex said this, and Alex is wrong, but if you don't believe in the 500, you don't believe in Jesus, and if you believe that he revealed himself to the 500, then you have to believe in Fatima, and if you believe in Fatima, then you believe in the Catholic Church, and it's like, what?
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that deserves some attention. Um, what does it mean to believe in Fatima?
They believe that it happened.
Well, yeah, I believe it happened.
So
Now
the whole
what?
point is, if you believe it happened, the initial communication was from Mary. And if you believe that Mary is an angel that can talk to people, then you have to believe in the level of deification that the Catholic Church provides to Mary, which means you have to believe in the Catholic belief system, which means you have to
That's
be Catholic.
quite a road. That
That's
is
what he said.
quite a. I know. I know. And
Yeah, and gosh, I, s- I can't wrap my like I have a lot of respect for Cameron Bertuzzi. I think I had a great deal of admiration for his work, and then he converted to Catholicism, and it, that's just that's just uh, that's just really dumb. That's a really
It,
dumb train of
it
thought.
was it was a super
I
crazy
don't
thing.
even.
So, like, I mean, first of all, I don't think Fatima happened in the way that Cameron thinks it happened. I think something happened at Fatima. I don't know what it was, but I certainly don't think Mary was revealing herself to these children, and then there wasn't this big reveal, and it wasn't Mary that was revealing herself to these people. Um, but it was just a crazy if then thing that he built up, and I've been seeing this a lot on the internet. I think
okay,
my
so
Yeah,
why aren't you Catholic? Why isn't everyone Catholic then?
I
like
think my
watching that.
algorithm is tuning because I keep clicking on Catholic arguments, and so I think YouTube's trying to make me Catholic. Um,
But every time I see something like that, I'm very interested in like seeing people make the case for things that I don't believe. Like I want to know why they think that. And every time I see like something like that from Cameron, I'm just like seriously, how did you wind up Catholic from that? Like I don't think that's what convinced you. I think that
oh,
you
bro, he laid it out. Like if you don't believe in Jesus, you can't be Catholic. Is that right? If you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Like that's kind of the kind of logic that he uses.
and it's I yeah, I don't that's that's part of the problem with the church is just we don't I think if you just sit down and read the book of Judges and just take it at face value and then go to a Catholic mass, you'll like a lot of the things that led to God, you know, punishing the Israelites, it's stuff they do routinely. Like Gideon was a important judge of Israel, and he built think one of his sons built an ephod, or maybe Gideon built the ephod. I don't remember the exact details, but an ephod was like this kind of vest that they would wear that represented their authority. Somebody set that up as a kind of way of venerating Gideon, and this God considered that to be idolatry. But he, sent the Philistines, or something happened that led him to realize we shouldn't have put that ephod up. But they do that all the time, like the way that they treat Mary and the saints, and like it's outright idolatry. If you just read the Bible and look at what God considers to be idolatry, I don't know how they oh no, it's not. We don't worship them. It's veneration. Well, you're relabeling it, but you're doing
And
the same thing.
intercession, they use that word a lot also.
Yeah.
They're not praying to Mary because she has divine authority. They're praying to Mary because we don't want to bother Jesus.
Yeah, which is we should do an episode on this.
We should.
We should.
So hey, listeners, do you want to see us bash Catholicism? We love it. We can't help ourselves.
I also couldn't help but think when you were talking about Paul and explaining how he was receiving and relaying the creed.
Yeah.
It just all I could think of it was the fourth general order.
To receive and obey and pass on to the
century. To repeat all calls to repeat all calls more distant from the guardhouse than my own.
Yeah.
Don't tell anybody, guys. I don't remember the
cut this out. Did. Cut that out.
You just told everybody.
We're editing.
Yeah. I've been out for 20. What?
Oh, I had to look it up.
I know, like the fourth general order. Like, really?
I thought it was the sixth.
I've been out for 26 years, guys. But yeah, our 10 general orders. Is it 10?
11.
11. Is that? Well, there's always that joke about
the 12th.
The 12th.
The 12th. Okay, and I never remember. Is it the 11th? Is it the joke?
Oh wait, maybe is it 10? Maybe it's 10.
Maybe it's only 9.
I don't do that one. I quit my post whenever I feel like it.
You know what? I'm out.
I'm done. Tapping out.
Cold outside. They won't even let me put my hands in my pockets.
And when I looked that up, by the way, I looked earlier during the show. I just saw another blurb that the Air Force and the Space Force are now going to accept recruits that have asthma.
Okay.
It's an indication of two things. One, they're failing at recruiting, and they're admitting that they're not really the military, and your physical fitness is irrelevant to executing your duties in said branch of service.
I love being a civilian, guys. I just love it. I've been out for 26 years, but like I'll still kind of pinch myself and be like, I'm not in the Marine Corps anymore. I could do whatever I want.
It sounds like you got a lot of trauma.
I actually had a really
the Marine Corps is living rent free in your head.
When people thank me for my service, I'll sometimes thank them for my 5-year taxpayer funded vacation
in Hawaii.
My 5-year paid vacation funded by taxpayers, because that's kind of what most of my Marine Corps experience was.
That's how I refer to OIF, Summer Vacation 03.
Yeah, but I'm being kind of serious. It really was kind of.
I'm being serious too. It was really hot.
Well, I had a 5-year paid vacation at taxpayer expense.
There were so many flies.
There were organized activities, but it was
like a camp counselor and all that stuff.
Yeah. But gosh, just being able to do whatever I want whenever I want. I don't have to file paperwork with anybody and get permission to like go somewhere when I want to.
I will admit that there's still times that like if I go do whatever I want to do, like say, take a vacation or take some time off or do something, there's always a part of me that's like, am I going to get in trouble?
Yeah. And then
like that's what
I do.
That does still go on in my head from time to time. I'm like, did I get approval? Am I supposed to be on vacation? Like, I don't know. It's weird.
Like if I have a late night and I decide I don't want to get up and, you know, walk to my kitchen or my computer is and work at 7:30 when I'm supposed to, because I work from home, I can just like, I'm just gonna not, I'm gonna just
Yeah.
gonna stay in bed and I'll just take a sick day and no one's gonna be like, where's your chit from sick bay?
One
Uh,
time, I used to work. One of my bosses, and we ended up working together again at a different company. And I actually got him hired, and then we were peers, which was really weird because like he was my boss and he was a big deal and got me promoted and everything. Jim Menendez, if you're out there, shout out. Um, One day he and I were just kind of sitting around chit chatting. And I was telling him a story about being somewhere and had been out entertaining clients. And, my next morning was a struggle. So I, mailed it in. And he was like, "You did?" And I'm like, "Yeah, man." And he goes, "I've never done that because every year when they make us fill out that alcohol, that like life thing, and it says, 'Do you ever miss work because of alcohol?' And he's like, 'I always check no.'" He's like, "You check yes?" And I'm like, "No, I don't check yes for that. Are you crazy?" But he was like, "I never wanted to do it because I felt like then you're an alcoholic." And I'm like, "Alcoholics go to meetings. Knock it off."
Yeah.
uh,
All right.
I think, did we solve Wes Huff on
We
JRE?
solved it.
We
We
did.
solved it.
Good job,
John,
Wes.
John, we solved it.
John, that's for you. We like to solve things
We
for
solved it all.
you
We solved all your problems,
because we
Jonathan.
know you like things solved, and we did that for you today. John, you're welcome.
All right. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and say stay enlightened, stay curious, and we will see you next week. God bless.